What you're looking at is a quick behind the scenes to get into the mind of how this all came together and also what the animation actually takes. I screen recorded most of the process in animating out this cool graphic that one of our designers, Mani, actually created a while back. This is important that we take some time every once in a while to try new things and really expand our creative horizons and learn things and/or expand on things that we already know. So I'm playing this at a ridiculous pace, anywhere from 200% to 20,000% of the speed that it takes to do this, so keep that in mind. Ultimately, you have to pick apart the graphic, and what I'm doing here is taking that outer shell and I am figuring out a different way to give it some motion. It has holes in it because it originally was made that way to make room for some text, but I'm using that now to split out into 3 different rings, all rotating at different speeds to give it an interesting kind of effect. Right there, I'm going ahead and changing the cadence of the speed and make it look nice. It's a really important part of the process, is making sure that you get all of the speed and the eases and all of those things so that it looks smooth and not all rigid. So there you go. You can see it's moving. The holes are changing. There's a lot of exploration that needs to happen in order to make this work. But the next thing that I'm gonna have to do is mask out the area that the secret 2 is gonna come down into. So that's what's going on here. I am keyframing and moving a mask in order to reveal a space where the secret 2 can come down. This is a part of the process you really want to get right from the get-go, because it can screw up things later on down in the line. So you'll see I'm moving around keyframes, making the actual timing work. Ultimately, what I wanted to do is have the letters come down individually and bounce. So that means we need to get into this graph editor and we need to change it so that the actual motion goes beyond where we'd like it to go, and then have that spring back. And so what you're seeing me do currently is move that around and see how it affects the motion and finding it. It can take a lot of time to find the right motion. You don't want things to look static. You want it to feel natural and happen in what I would call a non-linear way. Okay, now that we're done with that, we need to separate all of the letters so that we can get it to come down in an interesting way. So separated all of the letters out, we need to move them a little further in, and we need to retime them so that they come down in an interesting manner. That's what you see going on there. Testing, making sure that it times correctly with the mask from the ring. And there you have it. Everything is falling into place at the right time. There's a little bit of bounce in the letters, and it gives it a little spring in its step. So now we're moving on. There's also other areas of the graphic that need to be cut out when the ring comes to a stop. And one of those is the X that we use pretty often, the red X. So right now I'm making that motion for the X, giving it its own little piece so that it's not just static. It's going to fall right into place as well. Now comes the fun part. This is a trick that I use to write letters out. What we need to do is create a path for it to animate on, and that path has to be pretty perfect. Otherwise, it's not going to be an authentic representation of the text that our designer created. So what we're doing here is slowing it down so you can see how tedious of a process is. You look at the top left part of that S, it's not a smooth transition, and it kind of clamps on that top. So I need to move that frame up just a bit, and that's really going to give you the right shape that the designer intended. That's a pretty tedious process, so I'm going to fast forward through that. As you can see, we're still moving and going. This process takes quite a bit of time, and we are sticklers for perfection here. So we've got the path animating, and what's important here is that we need to see how it fits into the rest of the graphic. You need to always be going back and checking. This right here is played at 200% speed, so 2 times as fast as it's actually rendering. To give you an example of what happens when you start going further and further into the animation process. It takes longer and longer to load, but that's fine because we have a pretty strong idea of where we're going and we're able to see what's going on. Now, as you can tell here, we have a problem. This hand that was originally in the screen recording is not the right size to the actual end graphic. So what I need to do is have the letters right on and cut that hand out so that it looks and fits like the final end graphic does. As you can see, this is a pretty daunting process. Here I am actually cutting out that part of the hand. And as you see, it's covering that little area that the letters are eventually going to sit in. So I've got that to a good point. Moving on, really want to go ahead and start dealing with those getting ahead letters, figuring out placement, figuring out different moves that we could make. You really have to test and figure out what's going to work in the graphic. All right, now we want to move forward and get into the getting ahead text. Really just want to play with the graphic, figure out what looks good, what doesn't, where it's going, where it could come from, what it could do. So I'm playing with that. I'm going to do a rotation. Really want the motion cadence of it to be right. So we're going to go through and play with the speed, ease it in, do all that fun stuff. Now we're going to mask the outside, let it come in so it appears as if it's only happening inside of that ring. We're going to feather it, make it look nice, and change the motion cadence over and over, see how it plays with the rest of the graphic. That's what's going on here. It's all happening incredibly fast. And in a second, I believe we're going to slow down. Okay, so now we're going to expand, and I'm just slowing this down so that you can see how long and how tedious of a process this is. What I'd like to do is get those letters to rest fully inside of the graphic, but I want it to not just show up that way. I want it to feel like it's actually going to animate on in that manner. So I'm doubling down on the masks, and I'm going to separate that area and ultimately make it a, I believe what I used was a mask expansion, or in this case, a contraction. So now we're speeding back up, figuring out that area. We have the opacity changed so that we know where things are actually going, but it's ultimately not going to be that way. So here I am figuring out what that looks like, where the letters are actually going to sit, and trying to time it out so that the letters come in at an appropriate time. So this is still technically playing at a sped up pace. I believe it's at 200%. So this is twice as fast as things are actually happening. That gives you a little bit of insight into how long it actually takes to do this kind of work. And it's important that you don't skimp on any area of it. You really want to make sure that you check all your boxes along the way, or you're going to get to the end and you're going to have a mess to deal with. So we're speeding back up now. Now that I've got the center of the graphic figured out, What I want to do is create that space for the text to lie in the actual ring at the bottom on both sides. We haven't done that yet. We did it to the top piece, but we need to do it to all the other areas because we want the end graphic to look exactly how the designer designed it. So we're speeding up, creating the space. You have to do all the timing. That's what we're doing here, making sure that we get it to rest in the right area. Check the timing and render it out, see how we're doing. And here's an example. It's going really fast and it's rendering. Now that we have the ring cleared out in all the areas that it needs to be, I really wanted to take this graphic and turn it into something a little more special, a little something that's outside of the norm, and test my capabilities and learn. So one thing that I like to mess around with is three-dimensional space and using a camera to animate through that space. So what you're seeing is two screens. You have the right, which is what the user is actually going to see, or the person watching the video. And then the left side is the three-dimensional space looking at it from the top down. And what you're seeing me move here are the different elements that are inside of this graphic, and we're moving them forward and backwards in a three-dimensional space. So see, I'm pushing that further into the background. Want to see which piece is what. But the real end goal of this is to get a natural camera blur and a depth of field that you might get if you're going to be filming something. And we can do that with the camera tool, but everything needs to be spaced and sized appropriately if we want those things to remain the same look that the designer really wants. So think of it this way: if I push something further away into the background, then it's going to appear smaller. But what I want to happen is I want it to be further in the background so I can get a depth effect, but I want it to appear as though it's the same size. And we do that by pushing it further into the 3D space and then resizing it. And that needs to be done with every single piece of this animation. This is just the beginning of the three-dimensional spacing, and we're going to revisit it a little later on. Now we're going back, and I want to get the center piece, the is getting banner, in the right area, but I want it to have its own motion as well. So what I'm doing is putting it in the three-dimensional space, and I'm just going to try something because I have a little time to explore here, and I want it to move along an interesting path. So I'm creating this path for it to follow. Because we're working in a three-dimensional space, there is a lot of little tweaking that needs to happen in order for things to line up. Especially now at this point, as I put a camera into the sequence, every little movement of that camera is going to change the perspective of the graphic. It's important to me that I use the depth of field, so that's what I'm going to go ahead and select here. Want to double check the settings to make sure that everything ends up right. Now I really want to play with that camera and the motion that it takes through the actual animation. That camera is going to control what the end user sees, so we really want to make sure that that motion happens in a direct and meaningful way. This process takes quite a bit of time. So what you're seeing me do is move things around and resize them and make sure that they're sitting where I want them to be in the three-dimensional space so that different areas of focus come in at an appropriate time. What I wanted to happen was the way that you would read this, or the order that you would read this, to happen with focus as well. So I want the first thing to be in focus, the secret to, then getting ahead, then is getting, and then started. That way the user's eye has a little easier time following, especially when there's so much going on like there is in this graphic. At this point, nobody else had seen this project, and I felt like I wasn't necessarily in the right spot and wanted to get some insight from our creative director, David Carrillo. What he said, I definitely agreed with. The banner flag coming in wasn't necessarily working. It just didn't feel right, and I definitely agree with that. So we devised a new plan, and I was going to make that come up through the cuff in the hand. So there's that little space that you see in the hand, right around the wrist, and I was going to have it pop up through there in a subtle manner. Now we're actually going to go through and refine the is getting banner, and what we want to do is have that come out of the cuff like we talked about earlier, and that takes quite a bit of different movements. I didn't want it to feel stale, so I'm doing a little bit of a rotation. I'm having it come up and forward in a three-dimensional space, and that's going to give it a little playful feel. Now I need to mask it so that it doesn't show up on the hand. We want it to appear like it's coming out of the hand. This takes quite a bit of time to dial in and get right. I'd also had some exposure changes earlier, so I figured I'd get rid of those now as they no longer serve the purpose. Now that we have the camera movement pretty dialed in, I wanted to add the background topography map, and I wanted to give it a little extra flair. So I cut out major portions of it, and I did that so that I could put it in the three-dimensional space and have it have a little bit of a depth feel. If this was a seriously major project, we would have done every single line, and we would have made it into an actual topography map in the 3D space. We don't really have time for that right now, so I just cut out a couple different areas, which takes quite a bit of time. This is going to give the background a more dynamic feel. So here I am placing it in the three-dimensional space, but I haven't really resized it. What you're looking at on the right is all of those pieces as the camera moves around. And now we're going to check it out. As you can see, we're really getting that camera blur effect, but it doesn't fit the topography map look that we're looking for. It kind of looks like a bunch of meteors, which is a pretty cool look, and I really actually debated keeping it. But I wanted to do Mani, our designer, some justice in the graphic that he made, and also wanted to test my ability to get that depth looking cool and also maintaining the authenticity of Mani's graphic. At this point in the process, computers can really start to struggle. We do things like drop the resolution in order to help them work faster, but ultimately the rendering takes a while. There's so many moving components and there's so many calculations that need to happen that it just takes time. All right, so as you see, it's still rendering, it's working, but this render is really going to give me a solid idea of where I'm at in the process. But ultimately, I'm going to decide that I want to resize and figure out a different area for those topography map chunks. So here I am, resizing, rescaling, making sure that everything ends up in the right place. I've used that same layer as an opacity so that I can find where everything needs to be. All right, this is starting to feel better. Definitely need to play with it. I'm moving the camera around, seeing where things go. Want to test and make sure that everything is right in the depth of field chart. Make sure that nothing's out of place. Do a little more resizing. There's a lot of tinkering that needs to happen when you get into this type of work. At this point in the project, there are probably a couple thousand keyframes. Keyframes are essentially markers for where things need to be at a certain period in time, and almost all of them have been played with in order to happen in a non-linear manner. In other words, things don't move from point A to point B at the same rate the whole time. That rate will change. You slowly accelerate, you hit max speed, and then you slowly come back into a stop. At this point in the process, I had talked to Mani and I felt like something was missing. So we decided to have him screen record some more mock-ups, some handwritten mock-ups, to give it that organic feeling like this graphic is actually being created by hand. A lot of it actually was, but it's important to tell that story through the ending of the animation. So what I was going to do is get those screen grabs and I was going to filter them in the three-dimensional space in different areas around the screen so that you can fly through them. This gives it a little bit of an edgier feeling. It adds to the intrigue. It adds a little bit of confusion, like, whoa, this took a lot of work. Our designers are incredibly talented people. But what's more important to me is that I know that they love what they do and they always put the extra effort in. So I want to do his graphic design justice, and I feel like telling that story of commitment to quality is through putting the sketches out, all the different explorations that they take to get to their end graphic. So here I am cutting them up, respacing them, putting them in the right areas, making sure that they fit the graphic and don't detract from what's going on, but add to it. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. I know this was pretty long, but I wanted to make sure that there was some insight into what it takes to develop a motion graphic. This isn't intended to be a how-to video, but more just a look behind the scenes into how we go about doing things. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to get in touch with us. Drop a comment. We'll pay attention and make sure that we get back to you. But I would also just subscribe to the channel. There's going to be plenty of how-tos coming and more explorations. So thanks again, guys.